All right. Hi, Ricochet. I've got Paul Nelson and my father, David Berlinski, here, and I promised you that they would try to answer all of your questions. There were so many questions, I don't know if we'll be able to do it all in one video clip. But I thought we'd try and answer as many as possible. There's no question they won't try to answer. So why don't you guys take it away? You want me to read the questions?
Sure. Please read the questions, Claire.
um, Judith Levy asked, she said, Claire, this is also elliptical that lost me. I gather that there's a similar intellectual tyranny in social circles as there is in the humanities and social sciences. What kind of ideas exactly are these guys afraid to be associated with?
Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I don't know that we're afraid to be associated with the ideas. The challenge is to find a venue where we can discuss everything we want from evolutionary theory, which we do. We have total freedom in that regard. But we also have the freedom to consider ideas such as intelligent design, which you have a hard time discussing at a professional biological meeting, let's say. So what I like to think is that we have our set of toys and all the toys from evolutionary theory, and we can play with both. And that's intellectual freedom. That's something wonderful.
Okay, our member Stephen Dawson writes, Dr. Nelson is on the one hand an advocate of intelligent design, and on the other a young Earth creationist, i.e. the Earth was created about 6,000 years ago. Nothing wrong with the latter in itself, but it's not a scientific position at all. It's a faith position.
So, what on earth is the distinction between a faith position and a scientific position? They're positions. They can be defended well, they can be defended poorly, but to take refuge all the time in these false dichotomies that this guy is no good because he's not participating in the scientific method, but that guy is great, although his theories are preposterous. He is participating in the scientific method. Surely it's about time to get rid of this. It's about time to say that some guy growing up in Mississippi who handles snakes and worships the powers of the night might have been right about some important issues.
Well, how would you decide whether they were right? By what criteria?
How would you decide whether anything is right? It's a complicated, difficult, irrefragable struggle, and we do the best we can. We do the best we can with the totality of evidence available to us. There's nothing that should be ruled out of court or off the table. Some guy comes up to me and says, you know, Dave, I believe that the Old Testament is the Word of God. God spoke to the entire human race. On several occasions, that was one of them. That's an extremely interesting, reasonable position. Some other guy says, I believe God spoke to the human race through Newton, the development of mathematical physics. That touches a sympathetic chord in me because there's very few plausible explanations for the great gifts of the scientific revolution we've been vouchsafed. I'm not endorsing these positions. I'm saying interesting, reasonable. Why be afraid to discuss them?
I agree completely. And I think one comes at the truth by ordinary dialectic, by conversation, by discussion. I should correct something, though. When he says, I think the questioner says, I think the world is 6,000 years old, I've actually never assigned a date to my ideas about the creation of the earth. And what, I don't mean to insult the questioner, but what it shows is that he can do a Google search and read a wiki entry. If he actually knew my views on this, he would know that they're much more subtle than he's described.
Well, what are your views? Now's your chance.
I would say that a functioning planet like ours requires a lot more, a functioning planet that sustains life, probably requires a lot more than just an ocean and landmass. If we're going to have a living, functioning planet, we're going to need all kinds of bacteria. We're going to need a whole lot of viruses, in fact, which seem to be a reservoir of important genes and proteins for bacteria. But we're going to need all kinds of living things. And it seems to me that it's a perfectly reasonable position to say, is it the case that to have a planet like ours at all, with life on it of the diversity that we see, a great deal of that life must be co-present?
Co-present? What does that mean?
Present at the same time.
Present at the same time. In fact, the normal function of the human gut requires the presence of trillions of E. coli bacteria. But bacteria require the presence of each other, and you're looking, in fact, at a very complex web of relationships. And I see no reason to think that those relationships had to be built up incrementally over time. Certainly, it's possible to imagine that they were put in place synchronically, at the same moment. Bottom line, for me, if I'm free to use the tools of evolutionary theory to understand the world, then I should be free to use any tool or any idea of interest to understand the world. And I want to reiterate what David said. It seems to me to be a very stunted, cramped intellectual position to say some ideas are acceptable, others we will not talk about, with no clear distinction other than consensus.
Not only we will not talk about them, we will not tolerate them. And that's something quite good.
Yeah.
Well, let me amplify Paul's remark. There's a wonderful French proverb, "Les faits ne parlent pas." The facts don't speak for themselves. They always have to be understood and interpreted. Now, as a philosophical position, if I were asked to, I could defend the position that the universe is not 6,000 years old. It's about 24 hours. 24 hours old. It was created yesterday. Now, this is not a position I advocate or endorse, but it is a possible kind of intellectual position. Of course, philosophers have discussed this for a very long time. The essential point is that we must get over this very primitive positivistic idea that we are asked only to regard the facts, and the facts will clobber us over the head with their own interpretation. That's not going to happen. And if we pretend to one another that it is happening, all that we will accomplish is the same kind of stunted discussion we're having now.
Yeah.
I think that the argument that's being put forth is a little bit more sophisticated than that.
You mean ours or the other
counter
side?
argument, which is that there's a tradition of experimentation in science where the results can be replicated, and there's an epistemology that has been successful in the world.
To some
based on
extent,
this.
who would deny that?
But that this epistemology necessarily excludes any kind of metaphysical explanation, and it won't be successful to try to ascribe.
That's just hooey.
Explain why.
That's just hooey because the metaphysical nexus to which you're appealing cannot be amplified and clarified. That's one thing. And in the second place, what the experimental method is only a small part. What the experimental method is only a small part of science. Don't forget, science at its most powerful is a theoretical engine of inquiry. And in the third place, the extent to which we're actually familiar with the physical world can be compared to a cat licking the surface of a table and concluding it possesses a deep understanding of the molecular architecture of matter. We know only a small part, a very small part. We have received illumination in fits and starts to conclude either that we have a method that is infallible or deeply, deeply reliable, or that we've reached a mature understanding satisfying all our intellectual needs with respect to this small part of experience we've mastered. That's absurd. It's absurd.
I would add just one comment that the historical sciences require, as a necessary part of their armamentarium, assumptions which cannot be proven. The uniformitarian assumption, for instance, cannot be proven. You take it as a beginning starting point, and it's entirely possible to swap in or out different sets of assumptions to see what might follow from them.
Aristotle has a wonderful remark: no science can demonstrate its first principle.
Exactly.
I want to ask you the questions that are naturally provoked by that, but I want everyone on Ricochet to feel that their specific questions have been recognized and acknowledged.
We'd be both happy to do that.
Yeah.
But there are about 100 questions at this point, and it's natural for me to want to choose the questions that are most uncomfortable, rather than the ones from people who are naturally very sympathetic to what you're saying. But I want the people who are sympathetic to what you're saying to have a chance to ask questions too. Let's start with one more question, and then maybe wrap this up and try to upload it because it'll take some time. Stephen Dawson writes, I should note that some on the ID and creationist side, and by the way, I wouldn't say that we've got the ID and creationist side represented here necessarily. There are people here who are simply skeptical of the claims of the neo-Darwinian synthesis.
And there are people who are not.
Yeah.
Right.
But he says, I should note that some on the ID and creationist side do provoke hostile reaction in two ways. One is in failing to understand the science against which they're arguing. The other is in seeking to introduce creationism or some variant thereof into the public school science curriculum.
May I address both of those?
Yeah, yeah.
I'll take the latter.
Mhm.
I have no interest in introducing creationism in public science curricula. I tell audiences this all the time. But on the former, I'm a member of the Society for Developmental Biology. I'll be presenting a poster in Chicago next month at their annual meeting. I wrote my PhD dissertation at University of Chicago on the theory of common descent. I know a great deal of evolutionary theory. I regularly attend the meetings. I'm in the literature. I interact all the time with evolutionary biologists. I understand the science. In fact, you can't really adequately reject the claims, let's say, of neo-Darwinism unless you understand them thoroughly. So I'm sorry, I just simply reject his premise. And if he wishes
How
to...
would we establish that you know the science?
What other science would this charade be invoked for? You know, every time you criticize a point of Darwinian orthodoxy, the inevitable response is, hey, you guys don't really understand the beauty, the subtlety, and the mystery
Step
of our
back from
theory.
the politics of it. Would you be willing to anonymously take a test, the
That's
GRE?
ridiculous. We don't have to.
No, Claire, I would love to do that. In fact, I would love, is it Mr. Dawson?
Yeah, yeah.
If he wishes to communicate with me any particular point of contention about evolutionary theory. In fact, I feel comfortable in saying I love evolutionary theory. I love the important questions that arise, the tools that it offers. I don't restrict myself to evolutionary theory. The most precious thing I have, or that any of us has, is our intellectual freedom. And a conference like this, where we can use any tool we want from evolution, population genetics, systematic method, plus a bunch of other tools that you can't use at an evolution meeting, means we are preserving our intellectual freedom.
All right, one more question. What do you think are the most interesting tools?
In
Both of you.
Well, interesting tools within evolutionary theory?
No, the ones that you feel that this conference gives you access to that you wouldn't in a more conventional.
Well, I very much appreciated attempts, I still do, to go back to fundamental questions in biology and attempt at least to do what the great physicists have always tried to do. That is, penetrate behind the veil of appearance and see a stable world of mathematical relationships. That is my particular interest, and when I hear papers at this conference attempting just that, attempting, that is, to validate, to verify Darwinian theory and Darwinian assumptions, I think that's great. I think there should be much more of it. You know, there are some fundamental questions that those who are defending Darwin's theory today raised, and I think none of us raised them adequately. That is, none of us who are objecting or criticizing Darwin raised adequately. For example, we have no mathematical description of what it is for a part of space and time to be living. And I wish I had said that. I wish I had written an essay about that. That is something that the physics can provide, but the biology cannot provide. So I find that immensely stimulating. That is my particular perspective. I think that physics has made the kind of progress that it has just because some part of appearance was ignored in favor of a much deeper reality which could only be described mathematically.
I'll speak briefly to the tools question. When you consider a living thing, you can consider it strictly within a naturalistic or materialistic framework and ask the question, are the objects, are the patterns, the systems present here, the product of a process that had no foresight, no teleology, no arrow of
Good morning. You know what? This is our cue that we should end this video and...
I'll finish that in the next one.
Steve, I need to talk to you for just a second.
Good.
All right, Ricochet. We'll be taking more questions later. I know we didn't get to them all, but it was interesting anyway.